The alarm wasn't just loud, it was insulting. It was a high-frequency, solid-state shriek designed by some sadistic engineer to bypass the eardrum and drill directly into the lizard part of your brain, the part that understands panic, predators, and the sudden, terrifying absence of electricity. My entire house was dead. The dual monitors on my desk were black mirrors, reflecting a man on the wrong side of 35 with a sudden case of flop sweat. The low, reassuring hum of the server rack in the corner was gone, replaced by an oppressive silence. On my phone screen, the app glowed a furious, accusatory red. Critical power failure. Cryo-storage unit, 01. Internal temperature rising, minus 78.1 degrees Celsius. Estimated time to critical threshold, 18 minutes. 18 minutes. 18 minutes, until a package smaller than a shoebox, currently containing 3 bags of the rarest blood on Earth, would begin to degrade. It was O-negative, sure, but with a phenotype so obscure, it made rocking horse droppings look common. This particular batch, phenotype KK+, with an extra topping of some god-awful rare antigen, was on a layover in my garage. It had flown from a donor in Seattle and was scheduled on a red-eye flight to Boston in less than 6 hours, destined for the veins of a 9-year-old girl undergoing her 3rd and hopefully final round of chemo. And my power was out. I knew, with the certainty of a man who understood both physics and the depths of human pettiness, that this was not a rolling blackout. This was a targeted strike. This was an act of war. This was Brenda. My phone buzzed again. A new notification from my security system. Motion detected at the side of the house, right next to the utility panel. I scrubbed back the footage 30 seconds. And there she was, in all her beige pantsuit glory. Brenda Donaldson, President for Life of the Creekwood Estates Homeowners Association. Standing next to her was a lanky fellow I'd never seen before. A man who held a pair of bolt cutters with the casual familiarity of a violinist holding his bow. He looked less like a licensed electrician and more like a guy who'd offer to sell you your own car stereo back to you at a steep discount. I watched in glorious, high-definition 4K as Brenda pointed one imperious, perfectly manicured finger at my main breaker box. The man gave a nod, broke the utility company's little metal tag. A felony for those keeping score at home. And with a grunt of effort snipped the main service line clean through. The video feed, which was powered by the house, cut out at the exact same moment. My lips curled into a smile. "Oh, you magnificent fool." The alarm on my phone continued its frantic tirade. The temperature was now minus 77.9 degrees Celsius. I let it scream for a full 3 minutes. I wanted her to enjoy her victory. I wanted her to stand on my perfectly compliant, regulation-height fescue grass and savor the taste of absolute power. I pictured her smugly folding her arms, confident that she had finally beaten the nonconformist at number 112. Then, I stood up, walked out of my office, and went into the garage. The air in there was still and cool. Against the far wall, past the lawnmower and the neatly coiled garden hose, sat the source of all this drama, the cryo-storage unit. It was a sleek, stainless steel box, humming quietly on its own battery backup. But the red light on its panel told me that backup was only meant for brief interruptions, not a sustained siege. Next to it, however, was my real masterpiece. To the untrained eye, it looked like a large, modern metal cabinet, maybe for storing tools. It was painted a discreet charcoal gray and was utterly silent. But I knew what was inside. 16 deep-cycle lithium iron phosphate batteries, a 4-kilowatt pure sine wave inverter, and a transfer switch so robust it could probably survive a direct meteor strike. I called it the contingency. I opened the cabinet door. A soft blue light illuminated a panel with a single, beautiful, industrial-grade switch. It was chunky and silver, with a satisfyingly solid feel. Below it, a small plaque was engraved with 2 words, grid and isolate. The switch was currently pointing to grid. With a flick of my wrist, I moved it to isolate. For a moment, nothing happened. Then, a low, clean hum, barely audible, filled the garage. A series of relays clicked in a domino-like cascade. Inside the house, the lights flickered once, then came on. Not with the tired, yellowish tinge of the city grid, but with a crisp, pure 5,000K daylight glow. The server rack in my office whirred back to life. On the cryo fridge, the angry red light blinked out, replaced by a steady, reassuring green. The temperature alarm on my phone went silent. I was now an island, a sovereign nation of one, powered by spite and superior engineering. And I knew with every fiber of my being that the war had just begun. How did it come to this? How did I end up in a suburban arms race with a woman whose greatest joy in life was measuring lawn height with a ruler? It started, as most of my problems do, with a compromise. My late wife, Sarah, had loved places like this. Creekwood Estates. The name itself was a triumph of marketing over reality. There was no creek, and the only estate was the one owned by the developer who cashed out and moved to the Bahamas. To Sarah, the endless rows of identical houses, each painted a slightly different shade of taupe, tan, or ecru, represented safety, order, a place where nothing unexpected ever happened. To me, it was a psychological torture chamber designed by a committee of the world's most boring people. It's not just beige, I'd told her once. It's a symphony of beige, and the conductor is a woman named Brenda who thinks paprika is an ethnic adventure. Sarah had laughed and told me I needed a hobby. After she was gone, the house was just a house, but her memory kept me here. That, and a perverse desire to see how many of the HOA's stupid, nonsensical rules I could follow to the letter, while violating their spirit in the most spectacular way possible. Brenda Donaldson made it easy. She was a woman who had found her one true calling in life, enforcing the covenants, conditions, and restrictions, CC and R's, of Creekwood Estates. This 300-page document was her Bible, and she was its fire and brimstone preacher. Our relationship had soured early over a mailbox. The bylaws dictated that all mailboxes must be obsidian twilight black. I, having just moved in, had painted mine a shade called midnight iron. The difference was discernible only to electron microscopes and, apparently, Brenda. She sent me a formal letter. I, being an engineer with too much time on my hands, sent back a 2-page report from a materials lab, complete with spectrographic analysis, proving that the light reflective value and chemical composition of the 2 paints were, for all intents and purposes, identical. This act of rational, factual compliance broke something in her brain. It was like showing a crucifix to a vampire. She couldn't find me, because I hadn't technically broken a rule, but she knew I was mocking her. And she was right. The next skirmish was the garden gnome skirmish. I'd placed a small, classic red-hatted gnome by my rose bushes. It was a quiet protest, a tiny splash of color in a sea of beige. 2 days later, a fine appeared on my door. Violation of Article 4, Section 2, unapproved lawn fixtures. I spent that evening with a glass of whiskey and a copy of the CC and R's. The document was a masterpiece of vague but threatening language, but I found a loophole. It specified a maximum height for lawn fixtures, 18 inches, but said nothing about their form or style. The next morning, the gnome was gone. In its place stood a twisted, abstract sculpture I had designed and 3D printed overnight. It was made of black, HOA-approved recycled plastic, stood exactly 17.9 inches tall, and looked vaguely like a question mark having a seizure. I titled it, An Ode to Suburban Futility. I received no fine, but I could feel Brenda's hatred radiating from her house across the street, a palpable wave of psychic energy that probably curdled milk. This brought us to the current conflict. My hobby, my real hobby, the one that mattered, was volunteering for the Rare Blood Alliance. It was a small, nimble non-profit that acted as a logistics network for moving critical, rare phenotype blood products around the country. Most hospitals didn't have the specialized cryostorage for long-term holding, so volunteers like me, with the right equipment, acted as temporary waypoints. My garage housed a medical-grade, ultra-low-temperature freezer, the kind that costs more than a decent mid-size sedan. To ensure it never, ever lost power, I had a licensed electrician run a dedicated 240-volt line to it. The most robust way to do this involved a small, 2-inch-wide weatherproof metal conduit that ran for about 5 feet along the exterior wall of my garage before entering the house. It was neat, professional, and almost invisible. To Brenda, it was a festering wound on the pristine face of her perfect neighborhood. The official declaration of war arrived via registered mail, a delivery method reserved for tax audits and declarations of war. It was taped to my front door with enough packing tape to gift wrap a rhinoceros. The letterhead was embossed with the Creekwood Estates logo, a single uninspired oak leaf. It was a symphony of bureaucratic rage. It called my conduit an unauthorized structural modification. It accused me of running an unapproved commercial enterprise, citing the industrial nature of the apparatus. It was signed in a furious, spiky script. Brenda Donaldson, President, CEHOA. The final paragraph was the kicker. You have 24 hours from receipt of this notice to cease all operations and remove the offending apparatus. Failure to comply will result in the HOA taking direct action to ensure the enforcement of community bylaws, up to and including the removal of the violation at the homeowner's expense. Taking direct action. The vagueness was chilling. What did she think she was going to do? Arrive with a posse of fellow HOA board members armed with hedge trimmers and a can-do attitude? I knew better than to ignore it. A paper trail was essential in these kinds of conflicts. I picked up the phone and dialed her number, which I had saved under the contact name The Beige Witch. She answered on the first ring, her voice clipped and businesslike. Brenda Donaldson. Hi, Brenda, Alex Henderson at number 112, I said, my voice dripping with faux politeness. I just received your very formal letter. I have to say I'm a little confused. The offending apparatus you mentioned is a standard electrical conduit. It's about as structurally significant as a downspout. Are we fining for downspouts now? I can check mine if you'd like, just to be sure. There was a tight silence on the other end. Mr. Henderson, the bylaws are perfectly clear. Article 7, Section 4 prohibits any modification to the exterior facade of a home without prior written approval from the Architectural Review Committee. The ARC? You mean you, your husband Barry, and Carol from number 42 who thinks Wi-Fi gives her migraines? I sighed dramatically. Brenda, that conduit powers a medical device. It's for a specialized refrigeration unit. Cutting power to it would be unwise. I intentionally left out the details. Ambiguity was my ally. I don't know what you're doing in there, she hissed, her voice losing its professional veneer. But this is a residential community, not an industrial park. The board has voted. Remove it. Right, the board. Well, you can inform the board that denying power to medical equipment might have some legal ramifications they haven't considered. Perhaps you should consult an actual lawyer instead of just your well-thumbed copy of the CC&Rs. "That is not my concern," she snapped. "The community's aesthetic integrity is at stake. You have 24 hours." She hung up. I stood there, phone in hand, feeling a strange mix of fury and exhilaration. She was actually going to do it. The sheer, unadulterated arrogance was breathtaking. She was going to physically tamper with my property to enforce a rule about aesthetics. That night I didn't sleep much. I went to the garage and performed a full systems check on the contingency. I ran diagnostics on the inverter, checked the charge level on all 16 batteries. 100% thanks to the solar panels on my roof she hadn't discovered yet, and tested the transfer switch. Everything was perfect. It was a beautiful, self-contained system, completely isolated from the grid. My own private power company. My final act of preparation was to install a new security camera. A tiny, high-resolution dome camera, nestled discreetly under the eave of my roof, with a perfect, unobstructed view of the utility meter and the main breaker box on the side of my house. I wanted to see her face when she did it. I wanted to watch her commit a crime in crystal-clear 4K. Let her come. I was ready. The next day dawned bright and oppressively cheerful. I sat in my home office, pretending to work. On my main monitor, I had a spreadsheet open, full of meaningless numbers. On my second monitor, I had 2 windows tiled, the live feed from my new security camera and the logistics tracker for the Rare Blood Alliance. The shipment, call sign Angel 04, was a red dot moving steadily along I-90. It was a special courier van, equipped with its own short-term cooling, but it needed to be plugged in during layovers to maintain the deep freeze temperature. The tracker showed its ETA at my house was 2:30 p.m. At 2:01 p.m., they appeared. Brenda marched up my driveway like a general leading a charge. Her beige pantsuit was freshly pressed, her hair a helmet of immovable blonde spray. Behind her trailed the lanky man from the day before. He was wearing a grease-stained t-shirt and carrying the bolt cutters like they were the key to the city. She didn't even spring for a licensed electrician, I muttered to myself, a grin spreading across my face. She hired a guy who looks like he gets paid in loose cigarettes and stolen catalytic converters. This is going to be even better than I thought. I watched, transfixed, as the drama unfolded on my screen. Brenda stood back, arms crossed, a look of grim satisfaction on her face. She pointed. The man, whom I'd mentally christened Fingers, stepped forward. With a quick twist, he snapped the small metal tag the utility company uses to seal the box. A tiny, satisfying ping I couldn't hear, but could vividly imagine. He flipped open the panel door. He paused for a second, looking at the thick, black sheathed cables. He looked back at Brenda. She gave a sharp, impatient nod. That was all the encouragement he needed. He positioned the bolt cutters, squeezed the handles, and with a grunt that I saw more than heard, he severed the primary service line. The exact moment he cut the wire, my monitors went black. The house plunged into an unnerving silence, and then right on cue, the alarm on my phone began its hellish screech. Critical power failure. I let it scream. For 1 minute, I did nothing. I imagined Brenda's triumphant smile. For 2 minutes, I let the silence of the house press in. I pictured her turning on her heel, her mission accomplished, the neighborhood's aesthetic integrity secured. For 3 minutes, I savored the moment. The temperature in the cryo unit was ticking upwards, minus 78.1 degrees Celsius, minus 78.0 degrees Celsius, minus 77.9 degrees Celsius. Then my part in the play began. I walked into the garage, flipped open the panel on the contingency, and moved the big, beautiful switch from grid to isolate. The click of the relays was the most satisfying sound I had ever heard. The hum of the inverter was the music of the gods. The lights in the house flashed on, bright and clean. My computer chimed as it rebooted. The shriek from my phone cut off mid-wail. The little green light on the cryo unit glowed like an emerald. I went to the kitchen and put on a pot of coffee, my movements calm and deliberate. Through the kitchen window, I could see Brenda on my lawn, frozen in disbelief. My house was a beacon of light. Not only that, but the breaker that Fingers had tripped when he cut my line had also knocked out power to the 4 houses closest to me, including her own. My house was an island of brilliance in a small sea of sudden darkness. A furious pounding began at my front door. It sounded like she was using a brick. I took my time pouring the coffee into my favorite mug, the one that said "World's Okayest Engineer." I took a sip. It was perfect. Then I walked to the door and opened it. Brenda stood on my porch, her face a mask of rage and confusion. How do you have power?" she sputtered. "I had it shut off." I took another slow sip of coffee. "First," I said, my voice calm and level, "you didn't have it shut off. You and Fingers the felon there just committed a federal crime by tampering with a utility meter and willfully destroying public utility infrastructure. I have it all on 4K video, by the way. The resolution is fantastic. You can really see the rage in your eyes." Her jaw worked, but no sound came out. "Second," I continued, "I don't get my power from the grid anymore. I switched to the backup system." Her eyes narrowed. "Backup system? You mean a generator? That's a violation. I'll have you fined into oblivion. Noise ordinances, emissions. I knew you were up to something." I gave her a pitying smile. "Oh no, Brenda, a generator is so crude, so noisy. This is a residential community, after all." I leaned in conspiratorially. Can't disturb the aesthetic harmony. I closed the door gently in her face, turned the deadbolt, and went back to my coffee. It took her exactly 7 minutes to call the police. I timed it. I was sitting in my office watching the Angel 04 courier making its final turn onto my street, when I saw the patrol car roll up. 2 officers got out, their expressions radiating the weary resignation of public servants who know they're about to mediate an incredibly stupid dispute. Brenda was already on them, waving her arms and pointing at my house like it was the Death Star. I watched them listen patiently, nodding as she explained, in frantic tones, that I was running some kind of illegal power plant, that I had defied the HOA, that I was a menace to the community. I let them come to me. When the doorbell rang, I opened it to find the 2 officers on my porch. The taller one had a name tag that read Miller. The shorter ones read Davis. "Afternoon," Miller said, his voice flat. "We've had a complaint from a neighbor." "Brenda," I said, nodding. "Let me guess. Illegal power plant?" Davis sighed. "Something like that, sir. She also mentioned you accused her of a felony." "Alleged felony," I corrected smoothly. "But yes. Would you like to see the evidence? Or would you prefer to inspect the alleged power plant first?" They exchanged a look. This was clearly not going the way they expected. "Let's see the setup, sir," Miller said. I led them through the house to the garage. They looked around, their eyes taking in the neat, orderly space. I gestured to the contingency. "This is it, officers. A self-contained residential power system. 16 lithium iron phosphate batteries, a 4-kilowatt inverter, and a charge controller connected to a small solar array on my roof. It's completely silent, 0 emissions, and as of about 10 minutes ago, completely disconnected from the city grid." I opened the cabinet so they could see the guts. It was a thing of beauty. All the wiring was perfect, the connections clean, the components top of the line. Davis whistled softly. "That's some setup." "I like to tinker," I said. "Now, as for the complaint, I can show you the installation permits from the city, all stamped and approved. And as for the other matter..." I pulled up the security footage on my phone and showed them the video of Brenda and Fingers. Miller watched the clip, his jaw tightening. "Did you call the utility company?" "First call I made after I switched to backup power," I confirmed. "They seemed very interested in the part about the broken seal. They're sending a crew out to assess the damage. They also mentioned something about pressing charges." The two officers looked at each other again. This had escalated far beyond a simple HOA squabble. They were now witnesses in a potential felony investigation. They walked back outside and had a long, quiet talk with Brenda. I couldn't hear what they were saying, but I could see her face turning from red to a sort of pale, blotchy white. They weren't yelling. They were just explaining the reality of the situation to her. Finally, they got back in their car and left, shooting me a look that was one part annoyance and one part grudging respect. Brenda stood on her lawn for a long time, looking at my brightly lit house. The battle was over, but I knew the war was just beginning. She couldn't attack my power anymore, so she would have to find a new battlefield. The new declaration of war arrived a week later. The utility company had repaired the line, and I had switched back to the grid, keeping my backup system fully charged. I'd received a very apologetic letter from the utilities legal department, along with a confirmation that they were, in fact, pursuing legal action against Brenda Donaldson for tampering. I framed it. Brenda, meanwhile, had been busy. Unable to defeat my power source, she had decided to attack its origin. She must have spent hours trying to find an angle, a new infraction, and she found one. A new letter appeared on my door, this one citing a violation of Article 5, Section 3, roofline integrity and aesthetic uniformity. She had discovered my solar panels. They were discreet, low-profile black panels on the rear slope of my roof, completely invisible from the street. To see them, you'd have to be standing in my backyard, or, as I suspected, flying a drone over my property. A violation of at least 3 other bylaws, not to mention my privacy. The letter included a grainy, top-down photo of my roof. The fine was for $500, with a demand to remove the unapproved aesthetic modifications within 30 days. I read the letter twice. A slow, wicked grin spread across my face. This was it. This was the opening I had been waiting for. She wanted to fight about aesthetics? Fine, we'd fight about aesthetics. I spent the next 2 days, not in my workshop, but in my office, with a copy of the CC&Rs, a legal pad, and a pot of strong coffee. I cross-referenced every article, every section, every clause related to construction, landscaping, and accessory structures. I was looking for the seams, the cracks, the loopholes, and I found them. The bylaws were incredibly specific about certain things: fence height, shed size, approved paint colors, but beautifully vague about others. A grand, glorious, monumentally petty idea began to form in my mind. I wouldn't just add more solar panels, I would build a structure to house them. A structure so modern, so beautiful, so architecturally magnificent, and so utterly, hilariously out of place in this beige hellscape that it would make Brenda's head explode. It would be a temple dedicated to the sun, a masterpiece of malicious compliance. The next day, I made a call. I needed a contractor, but not just any contractor. I needed a co-conspirator. A friend had recommended a guy named Dave, a local general contractor known for 2 things: impeccable work and an allergy to bullshit. Dave showed up the next day. He was a man in his 50s with a grizzled beard, calloused hands, and eyes that had seen every bizarre homeowner request imaginable. I sat him down at my kitchen table and unrolled the preliminary blueprints I'd drawn up. He stared at them in silence for a long time. "So, let me get this straight," he said finally, stroking his beard. "You want to build a What did you call this thing? A photovoltaic brise-soleil, I said. It's a type of pergola designed to provide shade while also generating power. Right. A solar pergola, he grunted. A very, very big one. In your backyard. Because your HOA president is mad about a few panels on your roof? Precisely, I said. But it has to be perfect. It needs to be under 200 square feet of foundation to avoid triggering a more complex city permit. The height can't exceed 12 feet, per Article 9. The support beams have to be made of cedar, and the metal components have to be powder-coated black, from the HOA's pre-approved materials list. The plans have to be stamped by a structural engineer, and, I finished, tapping the blueprint. It needs to be able to generate enough power to run a small hospital. Dave looked from the plans to me, then back to the plans. He was silent for another long moment. A slow smile spread across his face, crinkling the corners of his eyes. "Henderson," he said, letting out a low chuckle. "I've been a contractor in this county for 30 years. I've built wine cellars that look like medieval dungeons and bathrooms that look like Roman temples. But this is art." He leaned forward, his eyes gleaming. "I've been waiting my whole life for a job like this. When do we start?" The first phase of the operation was bureaucratic warfare. Dave and I spent the next week transforming my ridiculous sketch into an unassailable legal document. He brought in a structural engineer who, after I explained the situation, took on the project with a level of glee usually reserved for children on Christmas morning. We compiled a submission packet that was over 50 pages long. It had stamped engineering reports, detailed material spec sheets, city pre-approval forms, and a site plan that was accurate down to the millimeter. We even included a community impact statement that was a masterwork of corporate doublespeak, full of phrases like harmonizing renewable energy with traditional suburban landscapes, and exploring forward-thinking aesthetic paradigms. I submitted the packet to the Architectural Review Committee, which meant I hand-delivered it to Brenda's front door. I wish I had worn a body camera. The look on her face as I handed her the thick binder was a cocktail of confusion, suspicion, and pure, unadulterated rage. She had no choice but to accept it for review. A week later, I got the approval letter. It was the shortest, most begrudging letter I had ever received. A single sentence on HOA letterhead. "The proposed accessory structure is approved." I knew, just knew, that she had spent days with her cronies and the CC&Rs, trying to find a reason to deny it, and had failed. The plan was too perfect, too compliant. She clearly approved it on the assumption that I would never actually build the monstrous thing. It was just another one of my weird protests. The morning after the letter arrived, at 8:01 a.m., a very large, very loud truck carrying a backhoe rolled down the street and parked in front of my house. Dave's crew was on site. The war had entered its next phase. The construction was a beautiful, orchestrated chaos. It was loud, it was messy, and it was a daily, unavoidable reminder to Brenda that I was not backing down. She, in turn, began a campaign of systematic harassment. Her phone must have had the police department on speed dial. The first call was for a noise complaint. It was 10:30 a.m. on a Tuesday. Officer Miller arrived, looked at the roaring backhoe, then at Dave's permit, which clearly stated that construction noise was permissible between 8 a.m. and 6 p.m. on weekdays. He walked over to Brenda, who was standing on her lawn in a bathrobe, and had a short, pointed conversation. I saw him gesture at his watch. He left without even talking to us, but not before giving me a weary, "Can you believe this?" shake of his head. The second call, 2 days later, was to the city's Code Enforcement Office. Brenda claimed the worksite was unsafe and a public hazard. The inspector, a portly man named Stan, arrived, clipboard in hand. He found Dave's site to be impeccably clean, with proper safety fencing and clearly marked stakes. He ended up complimenting Dave on his crew's professionalism and spent 10 minutes talking about the challenges of pouring concrete in the summer heat. Brenda watched from her window, her curtains twitching. The third call was for illegal parking. Dave's large pickup truck was parked on the street in front of my house. Officer Davis responded this time. He noted that the truck was legally parked, well outside the fire hydrant zone, and not blocking any driveways. He then spent 5 minutes leaning against his cruiser, chatting with Dave about the best local spots for bass fishing. As the structure began to take shape, the neighborhood started to divide. A few of Brenda's allies would glare at my house as they drove by. But something else was happening. I started getting subtle signs of support. A wave from a neighbor down the street. A quiet, looking good from the mailman. The most surprising ally was George, my neighbor from directly across the street. George was a timid accountant in his 60s, a man who I was pretty sure had been personally fined by Brenda for the audacity of his grass growing a 1/4 inch too high. For the first week, he just watched from behind his curtains. Then, one sweltering afternoon, he scurried across the street carrying a large pitcher of iced tea and a stack of paper cups for Dave's crew. He handed it to Dave, avoiding eye contact with Brenda's house as if it were the Eye of Sauron. "Doing great work, boys," he whispered, his voice barely audible. He glanced at me and gave me a tiny, almost imperceptible nod. "I've lived here for 15 years, he muttered, just loud enough for me to hear. "She once tried to fine me because my wind chimes were melodically discordant." "Godspeed, Alex, Godspeed." He then scurried back to his house before Brenda could spot his act of open rebellion. It was a small gesture, but it meant the world. The resistance was growing. Over the next 3 weeks, the structure rose from the churned earth of my backyard. It was even more magnificent than I had imagined. The foundation was poured, the thick cedar beams were bolted into place, and the black steel cross members were hoisted and secured. It wasn't just a frame for solar panels, it was a piece of sculpture. The lines were clean and sharp, a stark, beautiful contrast to the bland, cookie-cutter architecture of the surrounding houses. The final step was installing the panels themselves. Not the boring, standard blue and silver panels, but sleek, all-black monocrystalline units that blended seamlessly with the black steel. They were angled perfectly to catch the southern sun, forming a geometric pattern that was both functional and breathtaking. When it was finished, I stood in my backyard with Dave, and we just looked at it. It was glorious. A 20-foot by 10-foot monument to spite. "You know," Dave said, taking a long drink from a bottle of water, "I've built a lot of things in my life. Decks, additions, whole houses. But this is my Sistine Chapel." My internal monologue was humming. It was perfect. It obeyed every rule in her sacred texts. The setback from the property line was correct to the inch. The height was legal. The materials were all from the pre-approved list. And it screamed a giant, solar-powered screw you directly into her soul. The final piece of the puzzle was connecting it to the contingency. I ran the heavy-gauge cables through an underground conduit and hooked them into the system. I did a test. The power meter on the inverter spun. The batteries began to drink in the pure, unadulterated sunlight. My house was now capable of sustaining itself indefinitely, a self-sufficient fortress in the heart of enemy territory. Brenda's response was predictable. A week after its completion, a letter arrived from a fancy downtown law firm. It was a formal cease and desist, full of threatening legal jargon. It claimed the structure had fundamentally altered the aesthetic character of the community and was causing emotional distress to my neighbors. It demanded its immediate demolition. I laughed out loud. I handed the letter to my own lawyer, a sharp, no-nonsense woman I kept on retainer for just such occasions. Her response, sent via courier the next day, was a thing of beauty in its brevity. It was a single sentence. Dear Sirs, please refer to your client's approval letter for the structure in question. Dated date, a copy of which is attached for your convenience. Checkmate. Or so I thought. Brenda had one last card to play. Brenda's final gambit was to turn the community against me. The weapon of choice? The annual Creekwood Estates block party. An email went out to the entire neighborhood, announcing the date and time. It was the usual saccharine sweet invitation, promising hot dogs, a bounce house for the kids, and a chance to build community spirit. But at the very end was a new, ominous paragraph. Please note, it read, that a special community vote will be held during the party. We will be voting on a proposed amendment to the CC and Rs, Bylaw 11.3, which will address standards for large-scale accessory structures and their aesthetic impact. Your participation is vital to preserving the unique character of our neighborhood. It was a barely disguised public execution. She was going to hold a show trial right there on the community green space and get everyone to vote to retroactively outlaw my pergola. It was brilliant in its own devious way. But she had made a fatal miscalculation. She assumed I would meekly accept my fate. I read her email and smiled. It was time for a counteroffensive. I opened up a new document and began to type. 2 hours later, my own email went out to the entire neighborhood, the subject line reading, "You're invited. The first annual Creekwood Future of Energy Expo and BBQ." My invitation was a work of art. It announced a concurrent event at my house at the exact same time as her block party. I promised gourmet brisket smoked on site using 100% renewable solar energy, craft beer from local breweries, and live demonstrations of a state-of-the-art residential power grid. I invited everyone. I sent a special invitation to Dave and his entire crew. As a final flourish of cheekiness, I printed out a copy and dropped it in the break room at the local police precinct with a box of donuts. The day of the party arrived. It was a perfect, sunny Saturday. The battle lines were drawn. On the community green, Brenda had her sad-looking bounce castle, which seemed to be slowly deflating, and a single folding table laden with bags of chips and a cooler of off-brand soda. A handful of her loyalists milled about, looking uncomfortable. My front yard, meanwhile, was a festival. The centerpiece was my electric smoker, a high-tech beast I'd modified, chugging away silently, powered entirely by the sun soaking into my pergola out back. The smell of slow-cooked brisket filled the air. Dave was manning the grill, flipping burgers for the kids. I had 2 kegs of a local IPA on ice. Music was playing from speakers placed discreetly in my garden, also running off the contingency. Slowly but surely, people started to drift over. First a few curious neighbors, then families with their kids, drawn by the smell of good food and the sound of laughter. Soon, my yard was packed. Brenda's party looked like the saddest family reunion in history. I even saw Officers Miller and Davis park their cruiser at the end of the street, not responding to a call, but just watching the dueling parties with what I could only describe as sheer, unadulterated amusement. Around 6 p.m., just as Brenda was attempting to rally her dwindling flock for her special vote, I decided it was time for the main event. I stepped onto my front porch and clapped my hands for attention. "Hey everyone, can I have your attention for just a minute?" The crowd quieted down. I saw Brenda across the street, watching, her arms crossed, her face a thundercloud. "First," I began, "I want to thank you all for coming. When I moved here, I was told this was a community, and today you've shown me what that really means." I paused, letting that sink in. Now, I know there's been a lot of talk about my construction project. A few people chuckled. Some of you might think it's a bit much. Some of you might think it's an eyesore. And some of you, I said, looking directly at Brenda, might think it's a violation of our neighborhood's character. I want to tell you why I built it. It started because I needed reliable, uninterrupted power for a piece of medical equipment in my garage. It's a specialized cryo-freezer. I saw Brenda roll her eyes. Here it comes, the vague medical excuse. But it's not for me, I continued, my voice growing louder and clearer. I volunteer for a nonprofit called the Rare Blood Alliance. We help transport critically needed rare phenotype blood to patients across the country. My home is a registered layover point, a safe place to store these precious gifts while they're in transit. My freezer and the power grid that runs it isn't a hobby, it's a lifeline. The air went still. You could hear a pin drop over the low hum of my sound system. In fact, I said, I have a special guest I'd like you to meet. I turned and gestured to a woman who had been standing quietly on my porch. She stepped forward, holding the hand of a small, pig-tailed girl of about 9. "This is Maria and her daughter, Sophia," I said. Maria stepped up to the makeshift podium I had set up. Her voice was soft, but it carried across the silent lawn. "Hi, everyone. My daughter Sophia. She has a very rare form of leukemia. 2 months ago, she was in the hospital in Boston, and she needed a blood transfusion to survive her treatment, but she has blood so rare. We couldn't find a match anywhere on the East Coast." Tears welled in her eyes, but she kept going. "They found a donor in Seattle, a perfect match, but the blood had to travel 3,000 miles. The only way it could make the journey safely was because of people like Alex. The blood that saved my daughter's life spent 6 hours in that freezer in his garage." She looked at me, her face shining with gratitude. "You didn't just build a solar panel structure, Alex. You built a link in a chain that saved my baby." She hugged me, and the crowd erupted in spontaneous, thunderous applause. This was never about a gnome or a mailbox, I thought, as the applause washed over me. It was about a little girl in Boston who needed a helping hand, and all Brenda cared about was the color of my damn conduit. I looked across the street. Brenda was frozen, her face ashen. The public opinion of the entire neighborhood had just turned on her in a single, devastating moment. George, my timid neighbor George, was the first to speak. He strode out into the middle of the street, between the two parties, and pointed a trembling finger at Brenda. "Is this what our HOA fees are paying for, Brenda?" he shouted, his voice cracking with newfound courage. "For you to harass a man who is literally saving children's lives? For your lawyers? For your petty fines?" That's when Brenda snapped. "Rules!" she shrieked, her voice a ragged howl. "There are rules! It doesn't matter what he's doing in there. It's about the bylaws, the aesthetic harmony, the property values." She had completely unraveled. It was a full-blown public meltdown. Her carefully constructed facade of the calm, authoritative community leader crumbled into dust, revealing the petty tyrant beneath. In a final, desperate act of madness, she broke from her group and made a blind charge for my yard, straight for the pergola. "I'll tear it down myself," she screamed. She never made it. Officer Miller, who had evidently decided the show was over, stepped out of his car, intercepted her with the practiced ease of someone who has dealt with far worse, and calmly escorted the hysterical, sobbing Brenda back to her house. The war was over. An emergency HOA meeting was called the following week. It was held in the community clubhouse, and the turnout was unprecedented. Brenda wasn't there. Barry, her husband, sat in the back, looking like he'd rather be anywhere else on Earth. The motion to remove Brenda Donaldson from her position as president of the Creekwood Estates HOA passed unanimously. The motion to elect a new president saw only one nomination, a reluctant, terrified, but resolute George. He won by a landslide. The first motion George tabled as the new president was to formally commend me for my service to the wider community. The second was to declare my solar pergola a model of innovative and community-minded home improvement, and to grant it a permanent, irrevocable exemption from all future aesthetic bylaws. Both passed without a single dissenting vote. Weeks later, life in Creekwood Estates had found a new, more pleasant normal. The beige was still there, but it felt less oppressive. I was in my backyard, sitting in a lounge chair directly under my magnificent spite structure, enjoying the shade. The late afternoon sun was filtering through the panels, painting geometric patterns on the grass. Dave was there, sharing a beer with me. He was looking at my vegetable garden with a familiar glint in his eye. "You know," he said, "we could probably rig up an automated solar-powered hydroponics system for those tomato plants. Full climate control, nutrient delivery, the works. I bet we could get a tomato so perfect it would make a grown man weep." I grinned. "I'll draw up the plans." Just then, my phone buzzed. I looked at the screen. It was an alert from the Rare Blood Alliance. New shipment pending Angel 07. ETA, 48 hours. I looked up at the sleek, black panels soaking in the afternoon sun, silently converting it into life-saving power. I looked at the quiet, peaceful houses around me. Brenda had wanted a war over aesthetics. So I built a monument. She fought the wrong guy, and she fought the wrong war. Some people fight for power. I just fight for the right to have better power. And maybe, just maybe, for the quiet satisfaction of proving a point with about 20 kilowatts of sunshine and a whole lot of paperwork.